From Washington, D.C. and around the world, this is Government Matters with Frances Rose.
Tonight, we continue our expanded coverage of the Pentagon. Every Thursday, we'll focus on the latest headlines from the Department of Defense and sit down with some of the top minds in the DoD community. Thanks for watching Government Matters. Frances is on assignment tonight. I'm Colby Hockmuth. The head of the NSA's Tailored Access Operations, Rob Joyce, will become the new White House's cyber czar. Joyce took control of the NSA's hacking division in 2013. He's been at the agency for more than 25 years. Fifth Domain Cyber reports Joyce will continue the work of former White House cybersecurity coordinator Michael Daniel. 9 more officers are under indictment in the Fat Leonard scandal. The charges include bribery and corruption and allegations that the officers accepted elaborate dinners, luxury accommodations, and prostitutes in exchange for information that helped the business of contractor Leonard Francis. USNI News reports the highest-ranking officer charged is retired Rear Admiral Bruce Loveless, former Navy Director of Intelligence Operations. A top Army official calls business reform, success, and auditability the key to getting the money his force needs for modernization. Carl Schneider is performing the duties of Undersecretary of the Army. He says members of Congress have told Army leaders they'll provide the money the force needs. National Defense Magazine reports Schneider says Congress will base funding decisions on whether they see new business practices and audit results that provide savings and transparency. The White House released President Trump's FY18 skinny budget this morning, and in it, a $54 billion boost to military spending. But more pressing on the purse strings of government, the continuing resolution. Funding runs out April 28th. The House passed a $578 billion defense spending bill for FY17, but it's unclear how the Senate will act on that version of the budget plan. Retired Air Force General Larry Spencer is president of the Air Force Association. General, thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
I first want to get your take on the supplemental budget request. Is it funding the right areas?
I think so. First of all, it's the name is changed around. It's changed from a budget amendment. This was a supplemental. So I found out just this morning it's technically called a request for additional FY17 appropriations. And it's about $30 billion, about $7 billion of which there will go to the Air Force. So it is greatly needed. Just to set the stage. The Air Force, since Desert Storm, is the smallest, oldest, and least ready it's ever been. 30% fewer people, 37% fewer aircraft, 17% fewer aircraft per squadron, 59% fewer combat-coded fighter squadrons. So the Air Force is in really bad shape and really needs the money. So this will be a really big boost for the Air Force.
What areas are you thinking within the Air Force need to see the most funding?
In particular, I think the Air Force's #1 priority right now is to expand readiness training. I mean, right now the readiness for the Air Force is in really poor shape. So we have to get training for airmen, make sure our equipment is ready to go. So if they have to go into harm's way, they're ready and they're trained to go. But there are a lot of other requirements too. I mean, the maintenance, they need more people on the flight lines. You may have heard the Chief of Staff recently say they really need to go from 317,000 people to 350,000. This budget boost will take them at least from 317 to 321 on the path upward. They've got to upgrade some of their 4th generation platforms, air crews, more air crews. You know, there's a nationwide pilot shortage. The Air Force has got a real pilot shortage. So there's a plethora of requirements for the Air Force. And again, this will help, will not fix the things that the Air Force needs to do.
And there's a balance, right, when it comes to these budget requests of planning for the future and being ready now. How can, you know, as officials in the Pentagon are, you know, issuing these requests for their budget, how can they balance that?
That's a great question, and that is the challenge, because an Air Force exists to be able to fight large wars as well as more limited wars, and so you can't neglect either. And so there is a delicate balance between, obviously, any contingency we're in now is the highest priority right now, because we have to win the wars we're in now before we think about something else. On the other hand, we can't neglect the future because our potential adversaries are not neglecting the future. And as they are modernizing their fleets, modernizing the systems that they used against us, we have to make sure we keep pace with that and make sure we're ready for anything in the future.
And I want to read you an excerpt. General David Goldfein and the acting secretary, Lisa Disbrow, they wrote in a column in Defense One, the impact of uncertainties about our budget are exacerbated by the fact that our Air Force is the smallest, oldest, and busiest it has ever been. What's your take on that?
That's exactly right. And it's ironic. Now, we have to think back, though, how did we get here? I mean, as we went through sequestration and budget control amendments and reductions to the Air Force budget, the budget, the number of people we have, the equipment has steadily declined. And that's just not something that's acceptable for our national defense. And so the Chief of Staff and the Acting Secretary are absolutely right. We're in this convergence of where the Air Force has lost capability and lost people. At the same time, the requirement for the Air Force is growing. And so it's something that we really have to get corrected.
And when they say oldest, is that in terms of equipment?
Yes. So, for example, our bomber B-52 is 50 years old. KC-135 tanker, 50 years old. The average fighter is 26 years old. I mean, these are old platforms, and these are platforms that won't match the latest platforms that are being developed by our adversaries. So that's why things like the F-35 new fighter, the new bomber B-21, the new tanker, that's why these platforms are so critical and so important that we stay on program.
And I know that the details are just coming in today. This morning, President Trump issued his skinny budget, and we're still learning information about it. But what's your take so far, and what message does this sort of a boost send to the Pentagon? Well,
so interesting question. And so first of all, any increase is good. I, as a former budget guy, I spent most of my career cutting things. So this is good because money is coming in. However, I would sort of offer a caution. So if you think about the increase of $54 billion, that will take the DoD budget up to $603 billion overall. But you've already heard that people like Senator McCain are really advocating for around $640 billion. And that's because if you think about the $54 billion increase, number one, it starts with the baseline of the Budget Control Act, which was already less than what the services were expecting. You add on to that the increases that the previous administration had already put into the budget. So really $54 billion ends up about a 3% increase. Again, not bad. Obviously, any increase is good, but it will help but not fix the problems that the Air Force has.
Do you have any alternative suggestions?
Well, a couple. Obviously, I think as a country and as a nation, we really need to look at the plan that's being put forward for the larger amount. The other thing I would add, though, is one budget, 1 year at a time is not really helpful because you really need a long-term plan, a 5-year, what are you going to project for the future? That will give some stability. What the services don't have right now is stability. They don't know if they go into a contract now, is the money going to be there next year? If the Air Force increases its end strength, are they going to have the money next year to continue to pay for that end strength? So I would urge our Congress to not only think about the exact amount that the services need, but also stability over the long term.
General Spencer, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
A handful of top offices at the Pentagon still vacant. Straight ahead on Government Matters, how officials can still deliver on policy business as usual without top leadership in place. You're watching News Channel 8. Another potential top Pentagon employee is stepping away from a possible role in the Trump administration. Defense Secretary Jim Mattis withdrew his choice for Undersecretary for Policy, Ann Patterson, after the White House indicated an unwillingness to fight what it said would be a battle for Senate confirmation. David Chu is president of the Institute for Defense Analyses. David, we're 2 months into the Trump administration. How unusual is this, if it is at all?
Well, it's usual to have a gap. It's not perhaps usual to have this big a gap. I would reassure viewers, the department will function effectively in this situation because there are many terrific career civil servants who step up as acting persons. But the issue really is, what's the cost of this gap? And you create a certain amount of uncertainty with the gap because who knows exactly what the new appointees will emphasize in carrying out the President, Secretary of Defense's direction, the Congress's instructions. And there's also a burden on people. you're shorthanded. So some people are doing two jobs. Or put another way, some people are not paying attention to the lower priority amounts of their former position, and they're now in this acting capacity. And so when they go back to that position, they've got this backlog to deal with. So there are costs to the gap, the delay that is occurring here.
And in the service branches alone, we have Air Force Secretary, a name put forward, not confirmed. Picks for the Army and Navy secretaries have also withdrawn for consideration. How difficult will it be for the folks down the ladder at these agencies to go on with business as usual?
Well, again, you have a great career cadres, and of course in the services you have the uniformed personnel who will step in the acting role. But they will be reluctant, in my judgment, to take very significant long-run actions because they're waiting for instructions from the appointees who will be named eventually and I assume confirmed by the Senate. And so that's a delay, that's a period in which you don't necessarily invest in the future in the way you should. It's a challenge.
Sure. And switching gears a little bit, there's been talk of major Pentagon reform by the Defense Secretary.
Yes.
You know, as the details start emerging from this, logistics. Let's talk a little bit just about what this sort of a reform would take.
Well, there's several ways in which you could interpret reform in terms of Secretary Mattis' agenda. One is what he said at the first day of office, which is a little bit different tone from some of his predecessors, and that is an emphasis on the ability of our forces to fight today. Readiness, as people call it. And that does touch on logistics, because as people often observe, true strategists talk about logistics. Can I get the forces to the fight in time? Can I supply them once they get there? Can I give them the kind of special capabilities that make them successful? But he's also pursuing reform in response to the Congress's instruction. Congress has directed the department rearrange how it deals with the whole set of issues under the acquisition banner. That includes logistics. It is told to return to a structure it had in the 70s and early 1980s, which had its problems in that decade. So the challenge, particularly Mattis, is if this didn't quite work right before with this new congressional instruction, how do I make this successful going forward? And finally, he's concerned with efficiency, which again comes back to logistics. A lot of the department's expense is in the cost of supporting weapon systems, business processes, how we do contracts, who performs. So one of the big issues out there is the role of the private sector versus government depots in performing logistics functions. Thorny issue. A lot of politics attached to it.
And in terms of personnel, who's involved? Who are the stakeholders?
Oh, the stakeholders in logistics issues range widely. So primary stakeholder is the American taxpayer, because ultimately these forces need to be effective in the field for in protecting American interests. And so first question is, how well does the system perform in carrying out the military mission? And that's, in some sense, the secretary, military leadership, civil leadership of the military departments, they represent those taxpayers and the case for effective performance of logistics functions. But you also have those who are now performing that function. Those who might hold the contracts, those who are working in government facilities. They will be concerned with any change in those arrangements, whether those change about the nature of the contracts. For example, logistics has been enthused about so-called performance-based contracts. In other words, how you're paid based on how well the thing works, not just on what you did each hour in terms of your function. And the communities around the facilities where logistics activities take place, which are dependent on those payrolls, they're another stakeholder group. They are not likely to be enthused about changes that would affect the level of employment. If it's downward, if it's upward, everyone applauds. Downward, not so big.
David, thank you so much for coming on.
Pleasure to be here.
The biggest myth of having an active duty general as the National Security Advisor, debunked. Straight ahead on Government Matters, a breakdown of what to expect from Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster in the White House. Wednesday afternoon, the Senate confirmed Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster to serve in the National Security Advisor position as an active duty 3-star general. McMaster has been serving in the role since his appointment by President Trump in February. He's the 3rd active duty officer to serve as the National Security Advisor. Dr. Nora Bensahel is Distinguished Scholar in Residence at American University, and Lieutenant General Dave Barno is also Distinguished Practitioner in Residence at American University. Thanks to you two for coming on. You guys recently authored a piece in War in the Rocks where you sort of highlight the myths and concerns that revolve around having an active duty general in this sort of position. Nora, I'll start with you. Can you just basically get into the logistics of what is the role of a National Security Advisor, the can and the can'ts, just to give us a brief overview?
Well, the National Security Advisor, as it sounds like, is the main advisor to the President on all issues related excuse me, to national security. Traditionally, that person has a lot of access to the President, often not always walk-in privileges in the West Wing, and is the person that the President focuses on most to get advice. Certainly the other cabinet members, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of Homeland Security, and others play a very important role serving on the National Security Council, but it is the National Security Advisor who both chairs that process, helps the policy-making process, and usually has the ear of the President.
And now let's get to these myths, Dave. This first myth, a 3-star general in the White House can't tell 4-star generals in the Pentagon what to do.
Well, this is interesting because before his appointment to the National Security Advisor position, which is one of the most senior positions that oversees all defense and security issues and advises the President, as Nora said, he was a 3-star general in the Army's Training and Doctrine Command looking at Army futures, something relatively unconnected with what he's doing today. All the 4-star generals across all the services, which are more than 50, outranked him. Many of the other 3-stars in the military were senior to him. Now, all of a sudden, he's sitting next to the President. He's going to be the conduit of a lot of directions going to the Pentagon that will tell these 4-stars what they should be doing, what's going to happen next in U.S. Central Command, what the chairman of the JCS ought to be focused on. That's going to go through him, so he's going to be in an unusual position of essentially giving directives to people that, 3 months ago were much senior to him.
This next myth, McMaster, Secretary Mattis, and Secretary Kelly will be a united front. Nora, I'll let you handle that one.
They occupy very different institutional positions, and they have to represent those positions. And so they will not necessarily, just because they're all military men, obviously, both Secretary Mattis and Secretary Kelly are retired 4-star Marine generals. The common military background does not automatically mean that they're going to share a mind meld on every issue that comes up. It does give them a common foundation of experience, though, and that may be helpful to them as they sort through the policy process. But I think early on, especially when General McMaster was named to this position, there was a sense that they would be totally united, that they would do everything in lockstep, and that's just not the reality of bureaucratic politics, even though they may be more aligned in their worldviews and how they approach problems because of some of their shared experience.
It'll be interesting to see how that all plays out. Now, let's get to the concerns. An active duty National Security Advisor won't be able to oppose the Commander-in-Chief because he is active duty. Dave?
Well, he's in the chain of command. The President is the senior-most member of the military chain of command. And from day one in the military, you're taught that the chain of command is sacrosanct, that you follow all legal orders that are issued from the chain of command, which extends from the lowest private up through the captains and the colonels and the generals, all the way up to the Secretary of Defense and the President, the 2 senior-most people in the chain of command. So General McMaster is going to be sitting next to the President. The President's going to turn to him and say, General, I want you to do this. And part of McMaster's role is going to be to say, well, Mr. President, maybe we should consider A, B, and C. Maybe we should look at all the options here before reaching that decision. So he's going to be in an unusual position for a military leader to actually perhaps question the President, to push back against the President. Once the President ultimately makes his decision and he has all the information that McMaster has been able to provide and has the whole interagency informing him, then that order becomes something that everybody in the chain of command is going to execute. But in the meantime, McMaster is going to be in the unusual position for a 3-star Army general, certainly, to be telling the President, maybe that's not what we ought to do, Mr. President, and that's pretty rare.
Another myth, or another concern, I'm sorry. An active duty advisor will exacerbate the hammer and nail problem. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, there's been a lot of concern, not just with General McMaster's appointment, but also with the proliferation of retired, like with the exception of McMaster, who's still on active duty, of retired general officers in the senior White House positions, that this is going to really militarize U.S. foreign policy. And that's a legitimate concern because, you know, the hammer and nail problem is if, you know, what you have is a really, really powerful Defense Department and an administration that's led by military men, that the military will seem the best solution to every problem, whether or not it's suited for that. That is a legitimate concern. We don't think that the selection in particular of General McMaster exacerbates that because of all of the military men of his generation, he has one of the widest scopes of understanding of the national security making process. He wrote a book called Dereliction of Duty, which was about the failures of the generals and the National Security Advisor during the Vietnam War. It actually shot up to #5 on the New York Times bestseller list last week. A lot of people looking to see what he thinks. But based on a lot of his experiences since then, he really has a lot of outreach beyond the military community. He spent time in civilian organizations and civilian think tanks, has a tremendous network, and of all the people to occupy that, probably has one of the best understandings of the whole of government approach and the importance of other elements of U.S. national power in approaching national security problems.
Nora Bensahel, Dave Barno, thank you guys so much for coming on.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Don't forget, if you miss an episode of Government Matters, you can find it on our website, govmatters.tv. Wednesday's show is up there now. We broke down the potential impact of budget cuts on the federal workforce. Plus, reporting from Austin, Texas, FedScoop's Samantha Ellinger details the growing footprint of the federal government at South by Southwest. Back in 2 minutes. Women continue to make strides in the Defense Department and play an indispensable role in defending America's national security interest at home and abroad. On March 22nd, AFCEA DC is hosting a breakfast to celebrate female technology leaders at the Pentagon and explore agency priorities, initiatives, and programs. The event will take place from 7:30 to 10 a.m. at the Crystal Gateway Marriott and is free for government attendees. To register, you can go to afceadc.org. That's the latest from Washington. Join me weeknights at 8 and 11 on News Channel 8 and Sunday mornings at 10:30 on ABC 7 to stay plugged in on issues that matter for the business of government. Thanks for watching. I'm Colby Hocknews.